Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business.
Hello, this is Dan Sweeney, the Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business on the University of Denver campus. And welcome to episode 22 of Ethically Speaking, a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of a roundtable we just completed on the issue of sustaining sustainability programs. Our discussion leader this morning was Skip Spensley, more formally Professor James Spensley, goes by Skip. Skip is an environmental lawyer. He's been an operations research engineer and public policy consultant who has worked on the environmental and transportation fields for over 35 years. Skip has served twice as the governor's appointee to the Denver Regional Air Quality Council. More recently, and more importantly, he has served as an adjunct professor and lecturer on environmental policy and law at both the Sturm College of Law and the Daniels College of Business. So Skip, let's get into it. We had a great conversation with 15 or so people interested in the topic of sustaining sustainability programs. You made a comment that I wrote down here. You said, just remember, sustainability is a lifestyle, not a trend.
Sustainability, as we think of it, is considered to be a triple bottom line approach to achieving environmental, social, and economic goals for a company. This is normally a long process. It does not happen quickly in most situations. So companies need to be prepared to understand that it's over a long period of time that it will take to achieve a sustainable company. And along the way, they're going to undoubtedly have failures and successes as obstacles arise, whether they're environmental, social, or economic, that they need to push forward and continue to find solutions. So because we live in this sort of short-term world today, sustainability requires a long-term view. And what we are trying to achieve in promoting sustainability in these companies is not only that long-term view, but also a success in making the company more profitable, more efficient, and building a brand for their products or their services.
It's always seemed to me that this idea of sustainability, as I've seen it in the business world, seems to be a bit misplaced. I would much rather hear companies and their executives talk about the sustainability of their enterprise. In other words, making the enterprise such that it can last a long time, rather than focus just on how we're going to conserve water and recycle our waste and that sort of thing. How many companies do you think have that focus of sustainability being the enduring capability of the enterprise?
Well, if you look at the companies that would like to be recognized as sustainable companies, there was a work done by Corporate Knights, a Canadian company, who actually reviews, screens, and certifies companies, large companies. These companies have to have at least $1 billion of annual revenue to be qualified under this particular process. Last year, the Corporate Knights had applications from over 6,000 companies, of which they eventually screened and picked the top 100 companies that they consider to be sustainable. I would say that today, large companies particularly are recognizing the value of pursuing a sustainability title, if you will, so that their company can be successful in promoting their products or their services to their customers and satisfying all of the stakeholders, not just their investors or customers.
You do some teaching here at the Daniels College of Business as well as at the Sturm Law School here at DU, so you run into students quite a bit, quite frequently. Is it your view that these younger people, undergraduate students particularly, do have this idea of sustainability as part of their lifestyle? That's sort of the lens through which they view the world, much more so than previous generations?
I think that's true, Dan. Students today are entering business school not just with the idea of making money, but of actually pursuing a career in business that brings some kind of value, I would say sustainable value, to society. So yes, I do think that culturally we are seeing a change with people, the millennium generation, in the way they view what is the role and responsibility of business, and that role or responsibility is something that they want to continue to advance under the rubric, if you will, of sustainable business.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. It kind of strokes my optimistic genes. Thanks, Skip. During our conversation at the roundtable this morning, there was a lot of conversation about big business as a mandatory driver of sustainability. In other words, if we as a society or economy are going to make good, significant progress on the sustainability fronts, we've got to have that mandatory participation of large, well-resourced companies. And you mentioned Unilever as an example of one of those companies, and the fact that they have identified 4 ways in which sustainability programs have substantially contributed to the success of their company. Would you say some more about Unilever and those 4 items?
Well, Unilever actually funded a study last year that asked some 20,000 adults from 5 countries how their sustainability concerns impact their choices either in store or at home. And the results they found were that 1/3 of the customers that are now choosing to buy from brands that they believe are doing social or environmental good. We've also seen books written about this subject, but Unilever, as a large company, took this to then develop what they called simply 4-point framework for what sustainability does for their company. First, it drives growth. They felt that sustainability supported growth by deepening their brand equity and opening new markets such as safe drinking water and inspiring innovation. And their Sustainability Living brand demonstrates that in terms of their own business. Secondly, it lowers their costs by cutting waste and reducing the use of energy, raw materials, and natural resources. They create efficiencies and cut costs. And that cost avoidance and savings adds just to improve their margins. Third, it reduced risks. Sustainable ways of doing business help mitigate risks across operations. Operating sustainably helps them to what I call future-proof their business and make sure that they are not exposed to risks that are avoidable if they're taking that long-term view. And then finally, an important aspect of it, and I think a lot of companies have recognized, is that sustainability builds trust. It is really at the heart of the business model that strengthens their relationship with their stakeholders, which of course includes their investors and their customers. It helps them succeed as a business. It helps maintain their value and relevance to customers while inspiring their current and future employees.
Well, that sounds like Unilever is pretty committed and serious about this. I presume there are some other large global companies doing similar things.
Absolutely. In fact, if you look at a list of the 25 most sustainable companies identified every year in the U.S., these are U.S. companies, not necessarily global companies, although many of them are global, but the names include people like Nike, Hershey and Company, Biogen, Rockwell, MetLife, Oracle, Apple, Microsoft, Humana, PG&E. I mean, I could go on. There are many companies that have dedicated resources to trying to become a more sustainable enterprise.
Seems like they go across a number of industries. They're not just
right?
Technology or healthcare or anything. So it's a broad-based movement.
Absolutely.
Are there any particular commonalities among some of these companies that they all seem to be doing this, water or recycling or whatever, or is it a broad spectrum of activities as well?
Well, I think the first commonality, of course, is understanding the value that sustainability brings to their company, as we've already discussed. The other commonality, I suppose, is that technology today is giving us opportunities to become more sustainable either on the energy side or on the environmental side with new materials and new applications, or reducing waste, or a lot of what I would call the environmental sustainability sides. So many of the companies have adopted those technologies. They're not expensive in most instances, and in fact, by their adoption, they've actually lowered the cost for other companies to use.
Well, thanks, Skip. That's really interesting. I didn't know there was such a broad range across so many industries, doing such a broad range of activities, but things that are appropriate to those companies, and they're at the end of the day doing it in their own best interest as well. Thanks. Skip, it seems to me that there are a number of incentives or sources of incentives for these big companies to do what they're doing in the sustainability arena. For example, regulations from state, local, or even federal, or economics, cost savings, as you mentioned, social pressures from stakeholders, and so on. And I think at the end of the day, a very important one, which we haven't gotten to yet, is what I call the moral ecology issue.
Let me begin with the last one you mentioned, which was the moral or ecological conscience argument, the bottom line impact on companies. It's very clear that early advocates of sustainability use the moral argument or the ethical argument to try to make companies change their behavior. Unfortunately, too many companies still use the bottom line as the decision on many of these issues, or what we often refer to as utilitarian morals, that is, what's best for the most, and not always a long-term view, but a short-term view. I think more importantly today, though, regulations, at least when it comes to the environmental sustainability side, have played a very significant role in creating the incentives, either by mandating certain technologies or certain kinds of behavior, or imposing a cost on things that are not sustainable with regard to things like waste or externalities of pollution. So very clearly, they have had a major impact. Economics is, of course, the bottom line we've already had for a long time. And I think, as I mentioned this morning, on the social side, I think the whole social revolution today with the social media has created a channel for advocates of sustainability to emphasize the importance of companies making decisions that are in the best interest long term of their customers, their investors, their stakeholders, all of the people that make that company run. And as we know, the stakeholders today play a major role in shaping the behavior and the goals of companies, and those stakeholders are more in tune today using social media about whether companies in fact are acting in a socially responsible manner. So I do think that that has had a major impact.
I think there's one more incentive for companies whom I would regard as being on the forefront of thinking about their enterprises, and that is executive teams who run their corporations with a view toward the long-term durability of the enterprise, and they want these companies to be around for the next century plus, and I see that very much in large family-owned, privately owned, family-dominated companies. Is that your experience as well?
I do think that there are family companies that have taken on more of the responsibility because of the reputation of the family as much as the company itself. Although I have to point to the leadership, the executive leadership of a couple of companies that have stood out in my mind as being a force to deal with in adopting sustainability. One of them is John Mackey, when he started Whole Foods with $40,000 some 20 years ago and turned it into a $4 billion sale. He was a strong advocate of capitalism, but what he called conscious capitalism, that is, being responsive to stakeholders and for companies to pick what he called a higher purpose, that is, not just to make money for investors, but to serve some social need. He clearly is one who has changed the way Whole Foods did business and providing sustainable products, organic products, and so forth at a reasonable price to his customers. The other is a man named Ray Anderson, who unfortunately is not with us any longer, but he started a company, actually revised a company called Interface Carpets. Interface Carpet Company is one of the world's largest manufacturers of modular carpets for commercial and residential applications. And he was asked many years ago by his senior staff to give a talk about what Interface was doing in the environmental area. And he realized that he didn't know that. And so he picked up a book by Paul Hawkins called The Ecology of Commerce and read that book and became a strong advocate of environmental sustainability. And he took it to the point of increasing their market share, of doubling their profits by using sustainable principles in how they would deploy the carpet. That is, they would lease it rather than sell it. They would totally recycle it. They found renewable energy sources to do their work and demonstrated to many companies that you can be sustainable and still be bottom line profitable in that business. So I think his executive leadership has really made a difference in a number of industries.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. Thanks. During the conversation this morning, and by the way, you were quite well prepared for this conversation, you listed 6 ways to keep sustainability programs alive in a company. We haven't got time for all 6, but could you identify maybe 3 of your favorites and talk about them a bit?
Sure. I think the first one I would probably note is what I would call keep the faith. That is, companies that have become sustainable need to continue in the pathway that they have started and not to vary from that too much. It is easy today, particularly with a changing environment and new customer demands, etc., that companies will forget about their sustainability commitments and goals. So I think that they need to maintain that sustainability goal as part of their DNA, as I mentioned John Mackey has with Whole Foods. So that would be the first one. The second one, related to that to some extent, is that they need to be transparent. That is, they need to monitor their successes and report those to the public. The public will always be a little skeptical about the real reasons or how successful these companies are. And to the extent that successful companies with sustainability goals that are being achieved, they need to make that information available to the public so that they can make their own decisions about whether they want to continue to be customers of that company. And then finally, I think the idea of having to stay relevant to stakeholder needs. We've talked about stakeholders before, but stakeholders are defining the needs of companies today. And whether that's in the application of new technologies or in the demand for products that are good to the environment as well as socially good, companies need to maintain that open communication with stakeholders and make sure that they are following the changing views of people, the cultural aspects of sustainability.
So this issue of employing new technologies, new technologies show up affecting almost any industry you can think of. Can you identify a couple of pretty recent new technologies that are having a profound impact on the whole practice of sustainability?
I think there are 2 areas, Dan, where technology has played a significant role in achieving sustainability for companies. One, of course, is in the energy area. We are faced with some major issues today with regard to climate change and trying to reduce the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. And so companies have found that things like wind technology is becoming competitive with some of the other fossil energy technologies that we've depended on in the past. Water, another area where water has been a commodity that we have not treated with respect in the sense that we've always regarded it as a free, unlimited supply, and of course it is not. And so in the water area, the technologies that have helped particularly developing countries have been in the forefront. We know, for example, with one statistic that almost 5,000 children die every day from simply the lack of clean water. Well, we have a new technology that has been discussed recently is something called zero mass water, which is a technology that looks like a solar collector, a 4 by 8 foot solar collector, that actually can take the moisture out of even arid areas and create water as much as 8 liters a day from each of these 4 by 8 units, which only, or at least cost somewhere in the order of $4,000. Well, that's amazing because these technologies are now being deployed in places in Africa, Saharan areas of Africa, as well as in Phoenix and Tucson in this country, to produce water where they're not necessarily attached to a water supply system, and they can produce their own water at a very cheap rate. So there are lots of examples like that where I think companies, take 3D printing. I think that has tremendous capability in the future where we can now 3D print buildings as well as tools that NASA is looking at when they go to Mars. They're going to want a 3D printer to print the tools they need when they get there. They don't have to carry them up there. So all of those are ways in which we have learned to apply knowledge, i.e. technology, to solve problems of scarcity or of environmental impact in a sustainable manner. And I think that's going to continue.
Well, that's encouraging, Skip, because we know that technology is going to continue to advance probably at an accelerating rate. So we'll get better and better at not just sustainability, but probably many aspects of our lives. Thanks. Well, we had some very knowledgeable and engaged people around the round table this morning, and a lot of different conversations came and went. I'd be interested, Skip, in just pick one conversation that was particularly interesting to you, that you thought was a good conversation to have.
I thought the question that was asked about culture and whether this sustainability issue and how it relates to culture, particularly how it relates to this generation, the millennium generation, and the one coming after them, with respect to what they adopt as sort of the expected normal way of doing business. My experience in the classroom has been that my students, undergraduate students in particular, are much more open and accepting of the idea that for a company to be successful, it has to be able to provide a business product or a service that is environmentally sustainable, that is socially sustainable, and of course economically sustainable. That conversation to me indicates that the culture is changing with regard to how people view business and the role of business, and the fact that business really is about creating value to people, not just creating value to shareholders.
I would agree with that. The term that I used during that conversation was generational salvation, that we're going to be saved by this generation, especially as the young people who have grown up with that cultural appreciation of things like sustainability and other things, as they move to more influential positions in not only large corporations, but I think in significant governmental agencies as well. It's going to be a different world for us.
I think that's right, Dan, and I agree with that. But I also recognize that it is our generation that is going to have to provide some of the resources for them to do that. That is, this generation is going to be looking to us for guidance as to where they can get the capital, they can get the technologies to be able to be more sustainable. So I think the desire is there. They probably is going to take some time for them to develop the contacts and the relationships they need to be able to utilize the resources that our generation has to make the outcomes what they're hoping for.
Well, my point of view on that is probably the best way for them to do that is to get involved with a large, well-capitalized, well-resourced, substantial corporation where there's already a network in there for them to be part of, and there's already capital there. They don't have to use their own capital.
Right.
They can use the company's capital and then share in the rewards of that as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think more of the large companies are recognizing that that is a way for them to lever the opportunities for the younger people coming in to take advantage of the beliefs in sustainability.
Yep. So I still remain on the optimistic side. How about you?
I definitely am optimistic. And the more I teach and the more I interact with the young people today, just reaffirms that optimism.
Good. That makes two of us.
Ethically Speaking is a podcast of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business. College of Business. College of Business. College of Business.